kids are older, they're not born today, and they don't have any tantrums anymore, although they have other problems as well. So I cannot start with a story as Vivian did, but I do want to emphasize that what I will try to do is focus on a few of the projects that we've done and try to connect it with actually the theme of today, which is of course focusing on how does data, or how can data contribute to development. And so, as was mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and GovLab is an action research center based in New York. We are part of NYU, and we focus on how do we change the way we make decisions, leveraging new science and new technologies. And one part of GovLab focuses on data, and specifically we try to understand how can data actually inform the way we make decisions, i.e. make them more legitimate, make them more effective, make them more informed. And specifically what we've been trying to do the last few years is, in order to make better decisions through data, we actually need to have access to data. And so what we have tried to focus on is how do we unlock data that can inform decision making and that can create this data economy in a more equitable kind of manner. And so one area that we have focused on is how do we unlock private data assets for public good. And so that's the area that I will talk about today, which is the area that we call data collaboratives. Because in order to really unlock private sector data for public decision making, we not just have to ask the private sector to unlock and open up those data assets, which obviously will probably never happen, but we need to really become more sophisticated in how we develop partnerships with the private sector through data collaboration. So data collaboratives is ultimately what we call the new kinds of public-private partnerships for a data age that can unlock a private sector data asset for public good. And so what I will talk about today is some of the lessons learned by doing this work. And so we, for the last, I think, 3 years, we have developed, I think, the largest repository of examples on how the private sector, and Emmanuel has referred to some of his own examples, how the private sector has worked with the public sector or with researchers at large in order to unlock their data assets. And so if you go to datacollaboratives.org, you will find more than 200 examples that we have analyzed and have tried to make sense of on what is it that made it work, what was the value proposition, and how can we learn from it to ultimately then develop our own data collaboratives, which is what we have been doing as well, and I can also share some of the lessons learned there as well. And so the first, which already was of course mentioned by Manu, the first key takeaway is of course is that value from data doesn't happen automatically, right? And so basically the basic model is that in order to create value, you need to go from data to insight, and then from insight to action. And that's to a large extent, of course, a measurement, and I think measurement is the first part, i.e. from data to insight. But if we don't take the insight and turn it into action, then value might be limited, because the value would only be basically a research value. You would have a better kind of insight. And so what we are trying to work on is, A, clearly how do we develop advances in data science, but also we also need new advances in decision science. And how do we embed data science and decision science to really create value? Now, if we focus on insight, to a large extent, and again, this is not rocket science, to a large extent, we have 4 types of insights that we can generate from data and from data collaboratives. And they range, of course, according to the scale of complexity with regard to the analysis, and also they scale with regard to the amount and type of data that is required. And the first typical type of insight is, of course, better situation analysis, i.e. we have a better understanding of what is happening, of what did happen or what is happening now as a result of nowcasting or as a result of real-time data that we have. Of course, the second layer is then not only understanding what is happening, is also understanding why is it happening, right? And so this is then the typical diagnostic kind of analysis that is needed. And to a large extent, statistical agencies have done a lot of work on the descriptive analysis, but we also quite often need to go to the next layer and not only describe the situation, also try to explain the situation through diagnostic analysis. And that's where, to a large extent, this whole area of computational social science starts to become very relevant as well. Then the third kind of area and insight is, of course, prediction. not only what happened, why did it happen, what will happen in the future. And then the last one quite often is prescriptive, or it relates to also impact assessment. And so we see data collaboratives across this area of insights, but I think it is important, if we start talking about data, it is important to also start talking about what kind of insight are we talking about, and what kind of insight is needed to generate what kind of value proposition. Now, with regard to the value proposition, here again, there are a whole range of decisions that can be informed, but typically we focus on 4 big areas. One is around improving governance, both in terms of making it more transparent, but also in terms of developing better public services, for instance. And so we see a whole range of initiatives that actually do inform, and so the slides somehow don't show that, but this is, for instance, Global Fishing Watch, that actually leverages satellite data and combine it with also Google search data in order to then understand, for instance, illegal fishing worldwide, that can improve governance of the oceans, for instance. And then we have empowering citizens, which is both in terms of making better decisions, for instance, knowing where to go in order to have treatments, for instance, so you have actually a better decision-making individual level, but also the increasing area of data activism, so that you actually empower individuals by using data. And we see a lot of that kind of data activism that is actually emerging because there is better data. Now you actually have also a better insight what might be the problems in society, and as a result, you can empower social movements through data as well. And then, of course, creating economic opportunity by both innovation, but also, and that's, by the way, from my point of view, a critical element that's quite often missing and also hard to measure, by just simple optimization. And optimization quite often is ignored in the economic literature of actually the value of data, that you actually can just make things better, makes it more efficient, as opposed to constantly service delivery, service innovation. And then, of course, solving public problems is the last kind of value proposition with regard to data. Now, from my point of view, what we have as a society not figured out in order to really fuel those kinds of positive, and I agree, of course, with all the other speakers that there are also a lot of risks, and I will come to that in a second, but in order to really stimulate those kinds of positive uses by tapping into existing assets, such as private data assets, we really have to start looking into reuse. And from my point of view, the biggest missing governance approach that we have not figured out yet is how are we gonna start reusing data? Because a lot of the data is all, or a lot of the policies that exist are all about protecting data, but they're not really focusing on how do we ultimately start reusing data in order to generate public goods. And of course, the reuse of data is across a wide spectrum, right? And so not everything can be open, and not everything will ever be shared. And so what we are trying to focus out and try to understand is what are the levels of conditionality that will be required in order to reuse data, because typically data will always be shared under certain kinds of conditions. And so what we try to understand, what are those conditions, what are those operational models? And so based upon our analysis, we have like 6 big models that we have seen, operational models in which private sector data can be reused. And they, of course, range from more closed to more open, but they also range from more collaborative to more independent, right? For instance, a typical API is very open, but it's also very independent in the sense is that you don't really collaborate with the private sector around.
Explain API, people might need an explanation.
Also, an API is basically a device or a software approach to extract data from a server. That's the most simple, I think, explanation that one can use. But so we have public interfaces, data pooling, prizes and challenges, and then trusted intermediaries to ultimately intelligence generation, because to a large extent, we not always need to have access to the data. Sometimes access to the insight might already be sufficient. And that is also what we see happening more and more, is that many corporations, like for instance JP Morgan, are not sharing any data, but they are sharing the insight that they gain from the data, and that in itself can help, for instance, economic decision or economic policy decision making as well. All right, is this easy? And as an academic, I always feel the need to make sure that I'm not too academic. And so what we actually see is a combination of two movies. On the one hand, we have Groundhog Day, by which we mean is that it feels like everyone who wants to develop a data collaborative starts from scratch, right? So they're always reinventing the wheel, and they always need to, as if nothing has happened before, and as if nothing could be learned from previous exercises. So on the one hand, we have Groundhog Day happening in this space, and on the other field, the other area, we have the movie Field of Dreams. For those who don't see, it's a famous movie with Kevin Costner, who at a certain point in time in the movie shouts, "If you build it, will they come?" And we see indeed a lot of that happening as well, Field of Dreams kinds of exercises where you build platforms and then it turns out actually we forgot to think about the demand. And so most of those platforms are not sustainable and quite often don't address any real need. And so we have those two movies that ultimately lead to a kind of ecosystem failure, by which I mean, we really have not spent enough time on what is the demand. What is the kind of question that could generate value through data, right? So what is the demand? We also have not really figured out, especially in the private sector, on how do we professionalize the supply side in order to then reuse some of those data. I mean, most of those efforts are kind of ad hoc and really done by so-called data champions, which basically means that they're probably good in their job and that then get hired by other companies, and as a result, the whole initiative collapse. So the supply side is also not really well organized, let alone then the demand and matching the demand and the supply. And then, of course, we actually also quite often really have no sense about the impact. I always make the bad joke is that we actually are not that data-driven about using data. We don't really measure what is the real impact of data and how can we improve that. And so we need to really make progress there. And the second type of challenge is a challenge with regard to scaling, because what we see is that we really are not systematic, right? And that's the Groundhog Day kind of phenomenon, is that we really have no procedure yet that is systematic and well adopted in order to create data collaboratives. We also have not figured out, which Manu also referred to, how to do this sustainable. Typically, this is still under the rubric of data philanthropy. Well, data philanthropy is not going to scale if you don't really figure out how to actually do this over the long term. And then, of course, there are a whole range of challenges from a responsible point of view, which relate with privacy and security, but also with regard to, of course, data quality, which is other big challenge. I mean, actually, the amount of dirty data that resides across the world might actually limit the value. And so we may also want to start to think about how do we also start to quantify the dirty data aspect. And we also have, of course, cultural challenges. I always make another joke, which is that I have not ever met a person that got promoted because they shared data, right? And so you don't really have yet a culture where sharing data is embraced and is seen as this is the thing to do, right? Typically, it's all about hoarding as such. And then, especially from the private sector, there are a lot of concerns with regard to if we start sharing the data, are we going to lose our edge that we get with regard to access to data? So here are a few of the projects that we work on in order to actually deal with some of those ecosystems failures. And the first one is to collectively actually identify the demand side for data. I mean, it's like the amount of meetings and conferences that I've been to, which was only focused on the supply side. And then I go home and it says, okay, so what would you do if you would have access to the data? Then actually there is no list of questions that people feel like these are priority questions. If we would figure out a way to access the data, we would actually be able to answer. And by answering those questions, we would be transformative as it relates to, for instance, development. And so here is an initiative, the 100 Questions Initiative, where we source the questions that matter across 10 domains. And so we just finished migration, and so now we have like 10 questions that a cohort of bilinguals, which are domain experts that also are data experts, have identified, have ranked, and then ultimately have prioritized. And so the next domain is going to be gender, is going to be air quality, we're going to have future of work, we're going to have disinformation, we're going to have food, and so on, and so on. And so look at, anyway, unfortunately the URL is not here, but the100questions.org, and there you will find the attempt to tap into the collective wisdom in order to identify the questions that matter. Then the other area for addressing the ecosystem failure is to actually what we call professionalize the supply side. I mean, people sometimes ask me, who should I talk to in order to have a discussion in company X with regard to data? And then my typical answer is, I don't know, good luck finding the person, right? Because there is no individual at the moment quite often that has the title data steward, right? And so it's very hard to know who actually within a company makes decisions and should be engaged with regard to accessing data. And so towards that end, we have called now for the last few years, called for a new profession, which we call the Chief Data Steward. And of course, anyway, it might be not the best term, but it's the only term so far that captures what we really want to capture, which is a person that can act as a steward of the data. And so now we have a network, and we have about 190, I think, corporations that are now a member of that network that try to do some peer learning with regard to what is it that requires to actually establish those data stewards within companies as such. We also have a systematic methodology on setting up data collaboratives. So we now actually have a canvas that knows what are the steps. And surprise, surprise, this is an interdisciplinary kind of activity. It's not only data scientists that you need to set up data collaboratives. We also have a end-to-end data responsibility tool that actually assesses the risks across the life cycle, right? So we have seen several risks, but actually it is across the life cycle. And unfortunately, many of the approaches quite often focus on only one part of the cycle, such as algorithmic bias, for instance, is an important problem, but also it only deals with actually the challenge at the analysis stage. And so we need to have an end-to-end data responsibility approach if we really want to address the risks that we have. We also are working on the other big challenge, which is lawyers, because once you have actually find the person in the room that can unlock the data, then typically lawyers arrive, and then it takes years to actually unlock the data because we need a data sharing agreement. And so what we are trying to do is actually streamline the creation of data sharing agreements. And so this is the what we developed, the so-called contractual wheel for data collaboration in order to actually get lower the transaction cost of developing data sharing agreements. So final reflections, and I think some of those are already discussed by Manu, so I can go quickly here, is that we really have to, in addition to all those challenges, we also have to understand the political economy of data collaboratives, right? So we're talking about creating relationships with data holders, and then by creating those relationships, and especially from a statistical agency's point of view, then you quite often create also dependencies, right? And so we do have to try to understand how do we mitigate those dependencies, and how do we ensure that those dependencies don't lead to abuse of power positions, for instance. And so that's a critical element that we have to figure out. We also have to have end-to-end data collaboratives, as I said, data to insight, insight to action or decision, and that requires change management. It requires change management within the public policy making environment, but also within the private sector environment. We also have to prevent, meaning there's not a day that someone is in my inbox and says, why don't you join us, develop a data commons, right? And I think, anyway, that's all pretty important, but we also have to try to prevent the tragedy of the commons, i.e. how do we actually make that sustainable, right? And how do we make sure that actually a commons can deliver over time and is not just another one of those field of dreams kind of exercises. And then one of the elements here is that we really have to have a public discussion about reuse of data. Meaning we have a techlash, but we don't really have a discussion about what kind of data would you want to reuse, what kind of reuse would you not want to have, right? And what kind of reuse would we really have more of? And we have no discussion, meaningful discussion at the moment that actually deals with reuse. And lastly, of course, in order to scale this, we need to have a movement, which is why I'm delighted to have 300 people signing up, which I guess, Susan, is a signal of the emerging movement towards data for development. So I'm going to stop here. I probably went over time, but I hope this made some sense. Thank you.
Sure did.